With an extraordinarily narrow pricing range of $52,300 to $54,445, I think the TLX Type S is quite simply the best luxury car value going in the United States right now. But does that mean that the TLX Type S is the right vehicle for you? And does that mean that this is the best compact performance vehicle in the US? Let's take a look. Clearly, the first thing that I should do is talk about what Type S is and what Type S is not. When I first heard about the TLX Type S, I admit to being a tiny bit disappointed, and I ended up talking to a few people at Acura who reminded me that Type S has never been full-on M or full-on AMG. So the Type S is not designed to compete with the BMW M3 or the C63 AMG, and that's why this is significantly less expensive. How much less expensive? Comparably equipped, this is $9,000 less than an Audi S4. Which is a direct competitor. When you account for the standard feature content in the Type S, this is also going to be about $10,000 less expensive than the BMW M440i or the Mercedes-Benz C43 AMG, that entry-level performance model from the German competition. That's what Acura is targeting with the TLX Type S, not the full-on M product line. So instead of thinking of the TLX Type S as a fire-breathing BMW M3, simply think of this as the pinnacle of the TLX lineup. It takes everything that the TLX is known for and dials it up to 11. You could also look at the Lexus IS500 as a direct competitor to this, but the last one that I drove was over $61,000, so it's definitely in a different price category than this vehicle. In fact, for the price of a Lexus IS350 F Sport, you could buy a TLX Type S with significantly more power under the hood. Now, because Type S is not a complete reimagining of the TLX, all the shapes going on up front are essentially the same as the regular TLX. We get larger openings down here, but basically the same size grille with a different grille texture inside, darker chrome surround right there, the same multi-module LED headlights with the distinctive daytime running lamp swoosh and LED turn signals as well inside. My only complaint up front is the large Acura logo here. You'll notice it's quite shiny, and that's because this hides the radar adaptive cruise control sensor. But this module, this clear section right here, is awfully big for a modern luxury vehicle. I'm surprised that Acura hasn't shrunk it or stuck it somewhere a little bit less conspicuous. If I haven't already called the TLX a compact luxury sedan, I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And that requires a bit of explanation, because at 194.6 inches long, this is actually longer than a BMW 5 Series. But on the inside, we find legroom that is very comparable to a BMW 3 Series. And that all has to do with the extraordinarily long hood up front. This hood is approximately 10 inches longer than the hood that you'll find in a Genesis G70, for instance. This hood is almost a foot longer than the hood that we find in a Dodge Durango with a 6.4-liter V8 engine under the hood. And it really gives the TLX this really cool proportion. I love the look of this. This reminds me a little bit of the Audi A7 with the way the hood is so long, the tight body below, and then a really sloping sportback-like profile, even though this is a sedan. It's not a liftback like the A7. The long hood profile is a combination of design reality and a desire for long hood aesthetics. You'll notice that we still have a long front overhang, although Acura has tried to conceal it pretty well with a rounded front end. Front axle is right about there. The entire engine is in front of the front axle. And then Acura decided to give this a long dash to axle ratio, really stretching this distance out right here to help give this more of a rear-wheel drive proportion. In the rear, there's also a bit of visual trickery, helping that rear overhang look a little bit tighter, and then we have a small trunk lid behind. Moving all the way around the back, we have big quad exhaust tips down below, a slightly different rear bumper treatment than we find in the regular TLX, a small black spoiler at the top, and the trunk lid button is concealed right there inside that tail lamp module. These are full LED taillights. One nice touch back here is that the Type S gets an active exhaust system. The outer exhaust vents are the ones that are used in normal mode and comfort mode. If you engage any of the sportier modes, then it opens a flap and uses the inside exhaust tips. That's why there's more condensation going on right there on the outside ones than on the inside ones. This has been idling in normal mode. I just switched it over to sport. Acura decided to go in an interesting direction with the new Type S lineup. Not only are we going to be getting a TLX Type S, we're going to be getting an MDX Type S, and you can bet that an RDX Type S is following very shortly thereafter. With any of these vehicles, they could have chosen to give it a high-revving 3.5-liter V6, or they could have taken their existing turbocharged engine and simply cranked the dial all the way up to 11. But instead, they decided to design a new 3-liter turbocharged V6 engine. If I accidentally call this a twin turbo at some point in this video, I apologize. This is in fact a single turbo and that turbo is right over here on the driver's side of the engine. Although obviously there's some general engine designs that are common between the 3-liter and the 3.5-liter in the Acura lineup, this engine is almost entirely new. It shares mechanically very little with that 3.5-liter V6. It produces 355 horsepower and 354 pound-feet of torque, and all that torque comes on between 1400 RPM and 5,000 RPM. If you're wondering why Acura chose to use a single turbo rather than twin turbos, the logical reasons are price, packaging, and reliability. A single turbo unit like this has a little bit less plumbing going on, less weight, and it's going to be easier to stuff under this hood. You'll notice that the entire engine is right here in front of the front axle. The engine is mated to a standard 10-speed automatic transmission, Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system, and every version of the TLX Type S will get 21 miles per gallon combined. But if you get the summer tire option, you'll notice that the highway fuel economy score drops to 24 from 25. The Type S gets Acura's latest super handling all-wheel drive system, and this does require a little bit of explanation. You'll notice that the engine is sitting transversely across the engine bay, not longitudinally like we find in the G70 or the Lexus IS. And that's because this uses the same 10-speed automatic transmission that we find in front-wheel drive TLX models. Obviously, it has been beefed up for duty in the Type S, but the general design is the same. This engine will send most of its power to the front wheels under most driving situations, but theoretically it can send up to 70% of engine power to the rear axle and up to 100% of that 70% to a single rear wheel. But there are caveats here. The vehicle is not capable of sending 248 horsepower and 247 pound-feet of torque to a single rear wheel. On the other hand, this can send more power to the rear axle than competitive front-wheel drive based all-wheel drive systems, like you'd find in a Buick or a Volvo. And that's all due to one really cool trick with super handling all-wheel drive. The rear axle has a different final drive ratio than the front axle. And when the clutch is connected, the rear wheels are spinning ever so slightly faster than the front wheels. That gives this a rear power bias that is not possible in Volvo's mechanical all-wheel drive system. So if you want to drive this vehicle harder out in your favorite winding mountain road, you'll notice that you have yaw motions in the rear. The rear end feels like it's turning the vehicle around. It's going to be more eager to turn in under power than some of the competition. Super handling all-wheel drive is never going to make this feel like a Lexus RCF with a torque vectoring axle in the back, but it is going to make it feel an awful lot more engaging than a Lexus ES or a Volvo S60, which is a direct competitor to this. Building a performance vehicle is more than simply stuffing a more powerful engine under the hood, so Acura went back and tweaked a ton of stuff on the vehicle. We have the same basic double wishbone suspension up front, but with different dampers and different springs. The dampers are adaptive in this vehicle, so you can adjust between 3 different stiffness levels. We have bigger sway bars front and rear, large 14.3-inch brakes with big calipers right there. The tires are the same width as the tires that we find on the advanced trim 255s, but they're lower profile, 35 R20s in this model. And you have the option of factory summer tires. This is the wheel that you get with the factory summer tires, and this is certainly the model that I would get, mainly because the wheels are much more attractive. You could obviously get the model without the summer tires and put summer tires on yourself, but I think the summer tire option is very well priced, and of course we get the more attractive wheels. These wheels, in addition to being prettier, are also lighter, and that helps save about 20 pounds on the vehicle overall. Acura also adjusted the steering ratio. They made it quicker in the TLX Type S, and then they've added extra chassis bracing in the rear. On the inside, we find Acura's latest front seat design. This features a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, inflatable side bolsters, an extending thigh cushion, 2-position memory over there on the driver's door, a tilt telescopic steering column that's manual with a large range of motion, and the front passenger seat has the exact same range of motion as the driver's seat. That definitely puts this in a different category to some of the competition from Japan, which doesn't always have a driver's seat and a passenger seat that match. The only feature missing in these seats that you will see in the MDX at some point is an available front seat massage feature. Hopefully that's coming soon to the TLX. One thing to keep in mind in here is that if you're taller than I am, you might not find enough headroom. I prefer sitting in a more upright seating position, and I have about ½ an inch of headroom left. My hair is definitely brushing the ceiling. When you jump into the back seat, you'll see what I mean about this being a compact luxury sedan. This front seat's adjusted for me at 6 feet tall in a fairly upright position. I have about 2 inches of legroom left. With 77.4 inches of combined legroom, this is nearly identical to the S60, the Model 3, the G70, and has a hair more, but not a lot more. I'm talking fractions of an inch more than the Audi A4 or the BMW 3 Series. The rear bench is a little bit wider than some of those options, but as you can see, you can't really put an adult here. Definitely have to crane my head to one side, and if I attempt to squeeze over here on the right side, where this front seat is all the way back in its tracks, I can't actually put my legs behind the seat, and my feet are definitely cramped in that footwell. You should also know that thanks to the Sportback-like roofline, rear seat headroom is a little bit more limited than some of the competition. In order to put my head back there to the headrest, I do have to crane my head to one side. Rear seat passengers get air vents in the center console, a fold-down center armrest with 2 cup holders. The rear seats fold in a 60/40 fashion, but you'll notice the extra bracing right there with the Type S logo. You can put cargo from the trunk into the passenger area through this trunk pass-through, but it's going to be an awful lot more limited than in the regular TLX. Behind the trunk lid, we find 13.5 cubic feet of cargo space. That definitely puts this in line with the rest of the compact competition. Under the load floor lives a really huge foam divider where we find the tire inflator and the funnel for filling the vehicle, and the 12-volt battery if I lift that up. Now, it does appear that some sort of compact spare tire could fit in here, but there isn't one available for the Type S. In my exclusive Trunk Comfort Index, I give this 7 out of 10 points. It loses points for not having a spare tire and for that cargo area around the 12-volt battery not being efficiently used. We do have a handy helper handle to help you close the trunk lid, but the opening of the trunk is fairly small. The seats are upholstered in a combination of leather and imitation suede. If I focus on the rear seat, you'll notice the general design that we find in all 4 outboard seating positions. The center section, which is imitation suede, is kind of in the shape of a Bordeaux wine bottle. The rear seats are not heated or ventilated. The front seats are both. There's also black contrasting stitching with this interior. You can see the relatively aggressive front bolsters. Those are, again, inflatable. And we find a very similar design on the bottom of that seat cushion. Moving over to the front doors, we have a lot of soft touch materials, some carbon fiber trim located right there under that glossy coating. Soft touch materials down lower on the door as well, although we do find harder plastics down there at the bottom. Moving over to the dashboard, we find a lot of soft touch materials and some stitched materials as well. The dashboard definitely has a sporty and attractive look to it. It looks a lot like the Acura MDX. Now, one thing that I have noticed before is that there is a little bit of an inconsistency when it comes to materials. You notice if I zoom in right here on this corner of the dashboard, not all the textures quite seem to go with one another. We have some fabric coated A-pillars, which is definitely a nice touch with speakers integrated right there. 2 large air vents, decently sized glove compartment. I had no problem fitting a 10-inch tablet computer inside. And then we find a large infotainment system right there in the middle of the dashboard. The infotainment system is controlled via a touchpad right here in the center console. Lexus is moving away from touchpad technology, but Acura really seems to be embracing it. But it works a little bit differently. If I click this home button right there, you'll notice we don't just scroll around the system with a touchpad like you would on a laptop. Instead, if you want the option in the upper left, you stab on the upper left. If you want the lower right, we stab down there on the lower right. It does take a bit of getting used to, but it's a bit more intuitive than the system in the Lexus. However, it's still not as intuitive as a touchscreen, especially if you're using Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, because then this touchpad does not work in the same way. Then you really do scroll it around sort of like a mouse pad. The display itself is nice and large, pretty high resolution, definitely easy to operate. Apple CarPlay only uses the left 2/3 of the screen. It doesn't use the entire screen. Below that, we have the controls for the dual zone automatic climate control, heated and ventilated seats. There's also an auto mode if you prefer. This is the dynamic mode toggle. You toggle it around for the different drive modes: comfort, normal, sport, sport plus, you turn and hold. Individual mode is accessed by pressing the button, and then you can press and hold to adjust all the individual features. I'll go ahead and do that so you can see what can be adjusted. Up here you can see we can adjust the engine, the steering, the suspension, idle, start, stop, whether it's on or off, and of course the theme lighting in the vehicle. This does have a lot of accent lighting strips. They're running right here down the center console, across the dashboard, etc. And it's a 2-colored setup, so you can have a different color here and a different color in the footwell like we find in some other modern European vehicles. We have an engine start stop button there, auto brake hold, the Hunt and Peck style shifter here that we find in other Acuras. Again, that controller, volume knob, power knob, toggle for the track forward backward, a wrist rest, Qi wireless charging mat, 2 big cup holders, and then a large center armrest that opens to reveal a pretty big storage area. Moving over to the driver's side, we don't find the full LCD cluster that we see in the new MDX. Instead, this is a partial LCD design, which is perhaps a bit more fitting for a performance vehicle. We have these very distinctive analog gauges on each side, and then that multifunction display in the middle that gives us things like our turbo readout. We have a G gauge, status of the active safety systems, and of course a super handling all-wheel drive. We then have a flat bottom Type S steering wheel. This is likely the wheel that we'll also see in the new MDX Type S. Paddle shifters on the back there, controls for the infotainment system. These buttons would normally also operate the heads-up display, but that's not available in the Type S for some reason. So instead, that just features right there in that small LCD. Over here on this side, we have the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system, and then this toggle actually interacts with that multifunction LCD. For instance, you'd use this knob to scroll through all the various displays that LCD offers. I may have commented on this in the last TLX video, but one thing that I still notice in here is, again, the various textures that are all meeting here at one point. The A-pillar, the upper section of the dashboard, the door, the dashboard, and then the instrument panel cover, they all have kind of a different texture. Let me know if that bothers you down there in the comment section. The curb weight of the TLX Type S is fairly high for the competitive set. This model will range between 4,200 and 4,221 pounds, depending on the way you have it equipped. This model is the lightest because this has the summer tires and the lighter weight wheels. That is several hundred pounds heavier than the vast majority of the competition, over 300 pounds heavier than something like the Genesis G70. So in neutral handling situations, you will definitely notice the added weight, and of course the fact that there is much more weight on the front axle than in most of those rear-wheel drive competitors. This has nearly 60% of the weight up front because that engine is hanging entirely in front of the front axle. And that means that going downhill, like I am here, where my foot's not on the throttle, you'll definitely notice that the front end feels a little bit heavy. The added curb weight logically affects acceleration. It took 5 seconds for this model to go from 0 to 60 miles an hour. That is definitely slower than the BMW, the Mercedes, the Genesis, etc. In many ways, the best way to think of the TLX Type S is not necessarily as a direct competitor to the M340i, but the 330i, because for the price of a 330i, you could get one of these. This is also in the same price range as an IS350F Sport, and this is definitely going to be faster and it's going to be more fun. And you'll really notice that when we start going uphill. But before I talk about that, I guess I should insert the brake score here. Just 110 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour to 0. This does have the summer tires on it. Logically, the all-season tires would take a little bit longer. But I digress. Let's get back to handling here, because going uphill, this is just so much fun. The super handling all-wheel drive system and the fact that we have more curb weight up front make the handling incredibly predictable in the TLX Type S. Yes, it definitely tends to understeer in the corners, absolutely no doubt because of the extra weight up front, but we also see that in something like the Volvo S60 or the Audi S4, because the S4's engine is also entirely in front of its front axle. So this is not unique in that respect. But what is unique is that torque vectoring axle for the price tag of this Type S. This is just so easy to drive hard. And that's really the interesting thing, is that the TLX is just easier to drive at 9/10 and easier to find 10/10 than the vast majority of the competition. So as far as smiles on your face for a winding country road like this, I think the TLX is actually better than some of the rear-wheel drive only competition. I actually had a little bit more fun in this, I think, than in the IS500, and that did surprise me because the IS500 sounds better than this, it's faster than this, it's rear-wheel drive. In all of those respects, it's theoretically superior to this, but bear in mind, it's $8,000 more than this, and it doesn't necessarily put a bigger smile on my face because all of the power is so accessible in this. Standard all-wheel drive. The torque vectoring nature of the all-wheel drive system means that if you're in a corner and you feel like the car is understeering a little bit, all you have to do is add more power, and super handling all-wheel drive will correct that. So if we're going around this corner here, adding a little bit more power actually helps you steer around the corner like you would see in a rear-wheel drive vehicle. And that is the dynamic thing that's interesting about super handling all-wheel drive, is that there is definitely a dynamic difference power on and power off. Neutral handling around that same corner, the front end would definitely push. But if you're willing to add more power to the equation, you're rewarded with a tighter turning radius. And when you are out on your favorite winding mountain road, especially if you put this in Sport or Sport Plus, where it's going to hold those lower gears a little bit longer, be a little bit faster to shift, you will definitely notice the added power, and any concerns about turbo lag at the start definitely wash away. The TLX Type S, I think, is the perfect example of a vehicle that may not be the most fun out on a track, but is just unexpected amounts of fun out on a real road surface like the one that I'm on here. Because when I initially drove this out on Laguna Seca, I felt that it was a little bit large, a little bit underbraked, perhaps a little bit heavy, but out on roads that I know really well, all of that drops away, and this is just an absolute blast to drive. That's why I'm absolutely going to give the Type S an A when it comes to handling. Now keep in mind, that score up there at the top of your screen is as compared to other compact luxury sedans under $55,000. So you will logically find better handling BMW 3 Series, Mercedes-Benz C-Classes, etc., but not really for the price tag that you're paying for this. And they're not necessarily going to be that much more fun. They're not going to put the same size of smile on your face. So this absolutely gets an A. Out on a rougher road, like the gravel road that I'm on here, you'll definitely notice the difference between this adaptive suspension and the one that we find in the regular non-Type S TLX. In that model, the springs are perhaps a little bit too soft, because in comfort mode, if you're on a road with a lot of road imperfections, especially larger road imperfections or large dips, the suspension can sometimes bottom out, and it feels a little bit unusual in that softest mode, and I found myself never really using comfort in that model of the TLX This one is different. The firmer springs mean that when this is in comfort mode, it has a really good ride for a luxury sedan. This is still going to be firmer than something like a Honda Accord, but it doesn't have that same sort of bottoming out feel that you can sometimes get in the regular TLX. So if you are at all concerned about that, fear not, that does not happen in the Type S. If I move this over to the firmest setting, found over here in Sport, or of course if I turn and hold all the way over here to Sport Plus, things definitely firm up, but the TLX has a larger, more grown-up feel to it out on the road, likely thanks to its curb weight. Again, this is significantly heavier than the average compact luxury sedan. The weight of this is closer to the average midsize sedan, logically because on the outside, it is a midsize sedan. Continuing on with the numbers, cabin noise came in at 71.5 decibels at 50 miles an hour, making this equal to the TLX Advance, and actually a little bit quieter than the A-Spec. I'm not exactly clear why that is. I would have thought that with the summer tires on this and the exhaust, that this would be a little bit louder, but the truth is that when you're in the comfort mode, when it's only using the outer exhaust tips on this vehicle, it's very pleasant to drive. It's a very, very easy to live with vehicle. The suspension is comfortable, the exhaust is quiet, there's a ton of power when you want it, but it's never really going to be obnoxious. The other thing that surprised me is the fuel economy. I've been averaging 22 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving, and that's right in keeping with most of the performance engines in this luxury segment. So while I give the rest of the TLX lineup a little bit lower of a fuel economy score, I'm going to give this an A, because when it comes to vehicles with over 300 horsepower, this is very efficient. If you want better fuel economy than this, you're going to have to get a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid. Those are available in this segment, but they're going to cost you more than this, and they're going to add the additional complexity of a hybrid system. I love the way that Acura has tuned the Type S, and I hope that some of these tweaks make their way into the regular TLX model at some point. This steering ratio is just about perfect for the vehicle. The one in the regular TLX I actually thought was fine, but now that I've sampled this and I was able to drive the two back-to-back, I wish that they all had this steering ratio. It's quick, but it's not twitchy like we find in a Tesla Model 3. It has a good balance to it. Also well balanced is the suspension tune. Even in the sportiest drive modes, this is not going to be rock hard like some of the German options. This is always going to be daily driver livable. And while that may mean giving up a little bit of performance out on a track, the reality is most people aren't going to be driving this out on a track. They're going to be driving it out on a road like I'm on right here. And on this kind of road surface, you don't want something that is as rock hard as a BMW M3. For 2022, the TLX starts at $37,500. That buys you the 272 horsepower 4-cylinder turbo. If you want to get your hands on the TLX Type S, it is going to be considerably more expensive than the base model. It's going to start at $52,300. The base model starts at $37,500. But that's because most of what you've seen in this video is standard on the TLX Type S. Really, the only option package are the lightweight wheels and the summer tires together. Those are $800, and that is certainly the option that I would select because it is a pretty good deal. Even if you want to swap in all-season tires later, at least you're getting the more attractive and lighter weight wheels. When you compare the Type S to the competition, you'll notice that the base price on some of the alternatives may be a little bit lower than the Type S, but comparably equipped, they're generally speaking going to be more expensive. The Type S is all about value. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Type S is the best option, however. Let's take a look at some of the competition here. First up, the Audi S4. Acura was pretty upfront that the S4 was one of the vehicles that they were benchmarking very directly when they were creating the Type S. The S4 is a little bit less expensive, starting at $51,900, but if you want to comparably equip it to the Type S that I was driving, it would be around $64,000, so considerably more expensive because of the kind of features that you get standard in the Type S that are optional in pretty much all of the European competition. Now, it has theoretically a little bit less power, 349 horsepower from its 3-liter V6, but its 0 to 60 is faster. You might be wondering, why is that? Well, there are two reasons. The first one is that we may see some torque limiting in the TLX Type S in first and second gear. Acura has not been specific, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was going on. And the second reason, of course, is curb weight. The S4 weighs 3,847 pounds, the Type S 4,221. So it is quite a bit heavier, and you will certainly feel the difference out on the road. The weight balance in the Audi and in the Acura is really pretty close. Both vehicles have their engine entirely in front of the front axle, even though the drivetrains bear very little resemblance in terms of their design. They both have turbocharged 6-cylinder engines up front, but the one in the Acura is rotated 90 degrees from where we see it in the Audi. The key thing going on with Audi's Quattro system in their S4 and the A4, A5, A6, A7, A8, etc., is that the transmission and the front differential are integrated into the same case. But it uses basically the same 8-speed automatic transmission that we find in the BMW 3 Series. So in terms of power delivery capability front to rear, it's actually pretty similar to the BMW and the Mercedes. It's just that the weight balance ends up being a little bit more like the Acura because of where the engine is placed in the overall platform. Let's move on to the IS500. When the IS500 launched, it was right around the same time as Acura was launching the Type S, and I honestly hoped that the IS500 would be about the same price. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and the IS500 ends up being fairly expensive. It starts at $56,500. It's rear-wheel drive only, and if you want the premium package, that's $61,000. That gets you the upgraded sound, navigation, etc., pretty comparable to where we see the base TLX Type S, and it will top out at $68,000 with just a hair more features than we find in the TLX Type S. So comparably priced, the Lexus is going to be at least $10,000 more still. You're not going to get all-wheel drive. On the other hand, you do get a fantastic sounding 5-liter naturally aspirated V8, 472 horsepower, and 0 to 60 in 4.4 seconds. When it comes to handling, the IS500 definitely wins over the TLX Type S, and it certainly wins when it comes to feel. Lexus has a really great steering rack. And you should of course know that the IS500 is lighter than the TLX Type S, even yes, with that large 5-liter V8 engine under the hood. And again, even though that engine is big and up front, the weight balance is actually a little bit better than we find in the TLX. But again, you're going to pay a lot more for it. Now let's take a look at something that you won't necessarily pay more for. The Genesis G70. This has received a mild refresh for 2022. You can get 365 horsepower out of its 3.3-liter twin-turbo V6. For some reason, the G70 doesn't get the newer 3.5-liter twin-turbo engine. And it is considerably lighter, 3,774 pounds for rear-wheel drive. The all-wheel drive system makes it a little bit heavier. It adds about 200 pounds or so. But any way you slice it, it is definitely going to be lighter than the Type S. That'll get you 0 to 60 in about 4.5 to 4.6 seconds, depending on the options that you get. And it will set you back $44,200. So it is quite a bit less than the TLX Type S. Now that $44,200 will get you a model that's not as special as the Type S. If you want that, you have to get the Sport Prestige Pack that adds features that are relatively similar to what we find in the Acura, and a very similar price tag, $52,400. Depending on the exact dimension that you're looking at, the TLX Type S could feel a little bit roomier than the G70, but the difference is not going to be huge. Because remember, on the outside, the TLX Type S is sized a bit more like a Genesis G80, but on the inside, it's definitely a more compact car. It does have a wider rear bench, so child seats are going to be a little bit easier to accommodate back there. And I do like the way Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system feels. It makes it feel fun, but in terms of raw driving dynamics, especially rear-wheel drive driving dynamics, the rear-wheel drive G70 is simply going to be better. And if you want the added security of all-wheel drive, it is available with that particular engine. If you're interested in something a little bit different, Volvo has a plug-in hybrid system that you could consider a competitor to the TLX Type S in kind of an odd sort of way. It doesn't have the aggressive upgraded braking system that we find in the TLX Type S or lightweight wheels, but it will get you 0 to 60 faster thanks to its 405 horsepower plug-in hybrid system. Now, Volvo has tweaked their engine lineup a little bit for 2022, so some of the numbers have adjusted around a bit, and we have mild hybrid systems in the base model, but we're here to talk about the plug-in hybrid. It will effectively end up setting you back about $42,000 to $43,000 because it does qualify for a federal tax credit. And if you wait half a year, you're actually going to get 450 horsepower and a slightly larger federal tax credit because Volvo is bumping the battery pack size and bumping the amount of power that it can send to the rear axle up a little bit. Now, on the other hand, keep in mind that the S60, although it is definitely going to be much faster than the TLX Type S, is not going to be sportier than the TLX Type S. It's simply going to go faster in a straight line. If you start flooring it around in corners, you'll notice that you get torque steer up front and perhaps sometimes a little bit of rear end step out because on the back axle, we have an electric motor. On the front axle, you have about 300 horsepower from a turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. The torque steer is caused by the lack of a mechanical all-wheel drive system and the fact that under hard acceleration, the vast majority of power is always going to be going to the front wheels. Now, fuel economy will definitely be the best of the models that we've been talking about so far. It will get you about 27 mpg in real-world driving, and there is an all-electric range of a little under 20 miles. It's theoretically going to go up to about 30 to 34 miles, depending on exactly how the EPA rates it for 2022 and a half. But at the moment, you're not going to get a huge electric range. But it is going to be more efficient, and it is going to be less expensive. I also think that the interior feels more premium than the one that we find in the TLX Type S, but the last caveat to know about the S60 is that 2022 brings the new Google Infotainment System to the interior, and it honestly comes across as half-baked. I think it needs a bit more time in the oven. Volvo has said it has a lot of promise, but so far they haven't delivered on quite all the promise of that Google Infotainment System. Big omission still is the lack of Apple CarPlay and a number of integrated apps that theoretically it will have in the future. Bottom line for the TLX Type S, this is one of the best performance values available in the luxury segment. But I have to say, it ties with the Genesis G70 when it comes to that performance value equation, because the G70 3.3-liter turbo will give you slightly more traditional driving dynamics in a slightly more compact package. It definitely is going to feel more nimble and lighter weight, and it's going to have a longer warranty than we find in the Acura. I love the look of the TLX Type S, and I would love to know what you all think about that down there in the comments section below. It remains to be seen exactly how long-term cost of maintenance, cost of ownership will line up between the TLX Type S and the Genesis G70. The TLX Type S is definitely a little bit more of an unusual choice, I would say. The G70 is perhaps a bit of a safer choice. Let me know what you would pick down there in the comments section below. If you're looking for a good performance vehicle and you're looking to spend just barely over $50,000, TLX Type S and Genesis G70 would be my top picks. They're definitely going to be better value than we find in the BMW M340i or the S4 or the C43 AMG. But I suspect that if my own cash were on the line, I would probably lean a little bit more towards the Genesis. Again, let me know what you think about that down there. Be sure and check out the merch store at aoamerch.com. You can find shirts right like this one. Head over to facebook.com/AlexNotice to see what I'm driving this week. And of course, check out all those other social channels. I'll see you later.